Chapter 1. The Invitation to Snowdrop Cottage. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the frost clung to the hedgerows and the chimneys puffed steadily against the December sky, Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. The post had arrived late that morning, delayed by a snowdrift on the lane, and among the usual Christmas cards was an envelope of thick cream paper, addressed in an elegant, unfamiliar hand. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and slit the envelope with a silver letter opener. The invitation within was as intriguing as it was unexpected. It came from Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, a distant acquaintance from her school days, whom Miss Marple had not seen in decades. The letter invited her to spend Christmas at Snowdrop Cottage, a holiday rental in the village of Winterby, nestled in the Cotswolds. A small select gathering, it read, of interesting souls for a festive retreat. Do come, Jane. I feel your presence would lend a certain balance to our party. Balance, Miss Marple murmured, her lips pursing slightly. How very curious. Mrs. Hartley's tone suggested more than a mere holiday gathering. There was a hint of urgency, a shadow of something unsaid. Miss Marple's sharp eyes lingered on the phrase, her mind already turning over possibilities. In her experience, invitations of this sort often concealed motives far less cheerful than they appeared. Winterby was a 3-hour train journey from St. Mary Mead, and on the afternoon of December 23rd, Miss Marple found herself aboard the 2:15 express, her small suitcase stowed above, and a copy of the Times folded neatly in her lap. The countryside rolled by, blanketed in snow, the fields gleaming under a weak winter sun. She wore her best wool coat, its collar trimmed with fur, and a sensible hat pinned firmly against the wind. Her fellow passengers were few, a young man in a tweed suit, reading a racing paper, and an elderly vicar dozing opposite. Neither seemed inclined to conversation, which suited Miss Marple perfectly. She preferred to observe. Winterby Station was little more than a platform and a ticket shed, dusted with snow. A pony and trap waited outside, driven by a ruddy-faced man in a flat cap who introduced himself as Tom, the cottage's caretaker. "Mrs. Hartley sent me, miss," he said, tipping his cap. "Snowdrop Cottage ain't far, but it's a chilly ride." The journey to the cottage took them through Winterby's single street, where thatched roofs bowed under snow and lamplight glowed in shop windows. Snowdrop Cottage stood at the village's edge, a quaint, ivy-clad house with mullioned windows and a wreath on its door. Smoke curled from its chimney, promising warmth within. As Tom carried her suitcase to the porch, Miss Marple noted the fresh tire tracks in the snow, suggesting other guests had already arrived. The door opened to reveal a young woman in a maid's uniform, her face pale and her manner flustered. "Oh, you must be Miss Marple," she said, bobbing a curtsy. "I'm Elsie. Mrs. Hartley's not here yet. Delayed, she said, but the others are in the drawing room. Shall I take your coat?" Miss Marple smiled kindly, noting Elsie's nervous glance toward the interior. "Thank you, Elsie. I'll keep my shawl for now. It's rather chilly, isn't it?" The drawing room was a picture of Christmas cheer. A crackling fire, holly garlands, and a tree adorned with glass baubles. 5 strangers turned to greet her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to guarded politeness. A tall man with a military bearing and a grey moustache rose first. "Colonel Reginald Bryce," he said, his voice clipped. "Retired, of course. Pleasure to meet you." Next was a young woman with bobbed hair and a scarlet dress, her smile bright but brittle. "Lillian Vale," she said, extending a hand. "I'm on the stage. Well, when the parts come." Her laugh was too loud, Miss Marple thought, like someone accustomed to masking nerves. A man in a pinstriped suit stood by the window, his dark eyes assessing. "Victor Crane," he said curtly, offering no further detail. His accent carried a trace of London, but his manner suggested he preferred to keep his affairs private. Lastly, a couple sat close together on the sofa, their hands clasped tightly. "Mr. and Mrs. Harold Trent," the man said, his voice unsteady. His wife, a small woman with anxious eyes, nodded silently. They seemed ill at ease, as though the cottage's warmth could not quite reach them. Miss Marple took a seat by the fire, her knitting bag at her side. "How delightful to meet you all," she said, her tone mild. Mrs. Hartley's invitation was quite a surprise. "Have you known her long?" The question hung in the air, met with hesitant glances. Colonel Bryce cleared his throat. "Met her once, years ago. India, 98. Odd she'd remember me." "She saw me in the Merry Widow last spring," Lillian offered, tossing her head. "Said she admired my spirit." Victor Crane said nothing, only sipped his brandy. The Trents exchanged a look, and Mrs. Trent murmured, "She wrote to us about a mutual friend." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "How very interesting," she said, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. Already she sensed undercurrents in the room, threads of unease that tugged at her curiosity. Mrs. Hartley's absence, the guest's guardedness, the maid's nerves. It was all rather like a skein of wool, knotted in places, waiting to be unravelled. As the clock struck 6, Elsie announced dinner. The group moved to the dining room, where a table gleamed with silver and candlelight. But as Miss Marple took her seat, she could not shake the feeling that Snowdrop Cottage, for all its festive charm, was hiding something far less merry. "Before we move on, Detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're craving more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file gets even darker. Stay sharp." Chapter 2. A Frosty Arrival in Winterby. The dining room of Snowdrop Cottage glowed with the soft flicker of candles, their light dancing on the polished mahogany table. A centrepiece of holly and ivy lent a festive air, but the atmosphere among the guests was anything but warm. Miss Marple, seated between Colonel Bryce and Lillian Vale, observed the group with her usual quiet attentiveness, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The meal began with a creamy parsnip soup, served by Elsie, who moved with the hurried grace of someone unaccustomed to such a large party. The clink of spoons against china filled the silence, broken only by Colonel Bryce's gruff remark. "Damned fine soup," he said, dabbing his moustache with a napkin. "Though I'd wager it's not a patch on what we had in Simla. Ever been to India, Miss Marple?" "No, Colonel," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle, "but I've heard such vivid stories from friends. You must have seen a great deal there." "More than I care to recall," he said, his eyes distant for a moment before he turned to his soup. Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he lifted his spoon, a detail that might mean nothing, or everything. Lillian Vale, her scarlet dress catching the candlelight, leaned forward with a theatrical sigh. "Oh, I do wish Mrs. Hartley would arrive. It's awfully odd, don't you think? Inviting us all here and then not showing up herself." "Perhaps she's been delayed by the snow," Mr. Trent offered, his voice thin. He glanced at his wife, who was staring at her untouched soup, her fingers twisting the edge of her napkin. "Snow or no snow," Victor Crane said, his tone sharp. "It's poor form to keep guests waiting. I've business to attend to after Christmas. This was meant to be a brief diversion." He swirled his wineglass, his dark eyes flicking over the group, as if measuring them. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm sure Mrs. Hartley has her reasons. In my experience, people's absences can be as telling as their presence." Her words were soft, almost lost in the crackle of the fire, but Lillian shot her a curious glance. The main course arrived, roast pheasant with chestnut stuffing, accompanied by glazed carrots and potatoes. Elsie nearly dropped a platter, her face flushing as she apologized. "Sorry, sir, madam," she mumbled, retreating to the shadows of the room. "No harm done, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, but her eyes lingered on Elsie's retreating figure. The girl's nervousness seemed more than mere inexperience. Was it the guests, the cottage, or something else entirely? As the meal progressed, conversation turned haltingly to the guests' reasons for accepting the invitation. Colonel Bryce mentioned a fondness for Winterby's hunting grounds, though his eyes suggested he was not here for sport. Lillian spoke of needing a rest from the stage, her laughter a touch too bright. The Trents murmured something about needing a quiet holiday, but their clasped hands and furtive glances told a different story. Victor Crane remained tight-lipped, offering only that he owed Mrs. Hartley a favour. Miss Marple sipped her wine, listening more than she spoke. She had a knack for hearing what went unsaid, the pauses, the hesitations, the words chosen with care. There was a thread here, she thought, a connection between these strangers that Mrs. Hartley's invitation had deliberately woven. But what was it? As dessert, a plum pudding doused in brandy and set alight, was served. The conversation faltered. The flames cast eerie shadows on the walls, and for a moment the room felt smaller, the air heavier. Mrs. Trent dropped her spoon with a clatter, her face pale. I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm not feeling well." "Perhaps some fresh air," Miss Marple suggested, her tone soothing. "The snow is lovely tonight, and a short walk can do wonders." Mr. Trent helped his wife to her feet, and the couple excused themselves. Colonel Bryce muttered something about delicate constitutions, while Lillian lit a cigarette, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Nervous types, aren't they?" she said, her eyes narrowing. "Makes you wonder what they're so afraid of." Victor Crane set down his glass with a deliberate clink. "Some people have reason to be afraid," he said, his voice low. The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple's fingers paused on her napkin. She did not look at him, but she filed the remark away, like a piece of a puzzle she had yet to assemble. The evening drew to a close, and the guests retired to their rooms, their footsteps echoing on the cottage's oak floors. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her knitting in her lap, her eyes on the dying fire. The absence of Mrs. Hartley was no accident, she was certain, and the guests, each so different, yet each carrying a shadow of unease, were not here by chance. As she climbed the stairs to her room, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Snowdrop Cottage, with its cosy charm, felt suddenly like a stage set for something far less pleasant. Miss Marple closed her door softly, her mind already turning over the evening's observations. Tomorrow was Christmas, and she had a feeling it would bring more than just gifts. Chapter 3. Christmas Eve, Shadows. The drawing-room of Snowdrop Cottage was aglow with the soft light of oil lamps, their golden flicker casting long shadows across the patterned wallpaper. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth seemed to falter against the chill of unease that had settled over the guests. Miss Marple sat in a high-backed armchair, her knitting needles moving rhythmically, her eyes flitting from face to face as the group gathered after dinner for coffee and conversation. Colonel Bryce stood by the mantel, a glass of brandy in hand, regaling the room with a tale of his days in India. "Took down a tiger once, near Jaipur," he said, his voice booming. "Beast was a man-eater. Took 3 shots, but I got him." His moustache twitched with pride, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to the door, as if expecting an interruption. Lillian Vale, lounging on a velvet settee, toyed with a string of pearls at her throat. "How thrilling, Colonel," she said, her tone teasing. "I've only ever faced critics, and they're beastly enough." Her laugh was bright, but it faltered when Victor Crane, seated across from her, gave her a sharp look. "Some beasts are closer to home," Crane said, his voice low and deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his dark suit absorbing the light. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. His words carried a weight that suggested more than idle banter. Mr. and Mrs. Trent sat close together on a small sofa, their coffee untouched. Mrs. Trent's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Her husband murmured something to her, too low for Miss Marple to catch, but the gesture was protective, almost desperate. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the faint tremble in Mrs. Trent's shoulders, as if she were bracing herself against some unseen threat. The absence of Mrs. Hartley hung over the room like a missing note in a melody. Elsie, the young maid, entered with a fresh pot of coffee, her movements jerky. She spilled a few drops on the tray, and Lillian raised an eyebrow. "Careful, dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We wouldn't want to ruin the carpet." Elsie flushed, mumbling an apology as she retreated. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning over the girl's nervousness. Was it merely the strain of serving strangers, or was there something more? In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known maids who chattered like magpies, but Elsie was as silent as a shadow. "Odd, isn't it?" Miss Marple said, her voice soft and conversational, as if she were merely thinking aloud. "Mrs. Hartley's delay, I mean. One would expect the hostess to be here to greet her guests, especially on Christmas Eve." The room stilled for a moment. Colonel Bryce cleared his throat. "Trains, you know. Unreliable in this weather. She'll turn up by morning, mark my words." "Perhaps," Victor Crane said, his eyes narrowing, "or perhaps she's avoiding us." He smiled, but it was a cold, thin thing, like a blade catching the light. Mrs. Trent's cup rattled against its saucer. "Why would she do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her husband squeezed her hand, his jaw tight. "Oh, people have all sorts of reasons for staying away," Lillian said airily, lighting another cigarette. "Debts, scandals, lovers' quarrels." She trailed off, blowing a plume of smoke toward the ceiling. "Or maybe she just forgot she invited us." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking. "I doubt Mrs. Hartley is the forgetful sort. Her invitation was so particular." She let the word linger, watching the guests' reactions. Colonel Bryce's moustache twitched. Lillian's smile tightened. Crane's eyes flicked to the Trents, who seemed to shrink into the sofa. The conversation drifted to safer topics: Christmas traditions, the beauty of Winterby's snow-covered lanes, but Miss Marple's attention remained on the undercurrents. There was a tension here, a web of secrets binding these strangers. She thought of her nephew Raymond's stories. How he described the characters in his novels as pieces on a chessboard, each move revealing their nature. These guests, she felt, were playing a game they did not yet fully understand. As the clock struck 10, Lillian yawned theatrically. "I'm for bed," she announced, rising with a flourish. "All this country air is exhausting. Good night, everyone." She swept out, her heels clicking on the floor. Colonel Bryce followed soon after, muttering about an early start for a walk in the morning. The Trents excused themselves with a murmured good night, leaving Miss Marple and Victor Crane alone by the fire. Crane studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're a quiet one, Miss Marple," he said, "but I suspect you see more than you let on." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Oh, I'm just an old spinster, Mr. Crane. I find people so interesting, don't you? They have such stories to tell, even when they don't mean to." He gave a short laugh, rising from his chair. "Good night, Miss Marple. Mind the shadows in this old house. They have stories too." With that, he left, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Miss Marple remained by the fire, her knitting untouched now. The cottage was silent save for the wind outside, rattling the windows like an impatient guest. She thought of Crane's parting words, the way his eyes had lingered on her. There was something here, she was certain, something that had drawn these people to Snowdrop Cottage. And she suspected that Mrs. Hartley's absence was not a delay, but a deliberate piece of the puzzle. As she rose to retire, a faint creak came from the hallway, as if someone were moving stealthily. Miss Marple paused, her hand on the doorknob, her senses sharp. Tomorrow was Christmas, and she had a feeling it would bring more than just festive cheer. Chapter 4. The Colonel Behind a Locked Door. Christmas morning dawned over Winterby with a hush, the snow falling in soft, relentless flakes that muffled the world outside Snowdrop Cottage. Miss Marple awoke early, her room warmed by a small fire that Elsie must have tended before dawn. Through the frosted window, the village lay still, its thatched roofs and church spire draped in white. Yet the peace of the scene was at odds with the unease that had settled in Miss Marple's mind the previous night. She dressed carefully in a tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, pinning her brooch with precision. As she descended the stairs, the house was quiet, save for the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. The other guests, it seemed, were not yet stirring. In the dining room, a breakfast of porridge, toast, and marmalade had been laid out, but the table was empty. Miss Marple helped herself to a cup of tea and settled by the window, her eyes scanning the snowy garden for any sign of the previous night's creak in the hallway. At 8:30, a piercing scream shattered the silence. It came from upstairs, followed by Elsie's frantic footsteps. Miss Marple set down her cup and hurried to the staircase, where she met Lillian Vale, her face pale beneath her makeup, clutching the banister. "What's happened?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but firm. It's Colonel Bryce," Lillian stammered, her eyes wide. "He's in his room, Oh, it's awful." Miss Marple followed Lillian upstairs. Where the other guests were emerging from their rooms, Mr. and Mrs. Trent stood in their doorway, his arm around her trembling shoulders. Victor Crane appeared last, his expression unreadable, his tie already knotted with meticulous care. Elsie stood outside the Colonel's door, wringing her hands. "I went to bring his tea," she whispered. "I knocked, but he didn't answer. The door was locked, so I used the spare key. He's just lying there." Miss Marple stepped into the room, her senses sharp. Colonel Bryce lay on his bed, fully dressed in the previous night's clothes, his face grey and still. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, and his hands were folded neatly across his chest. The room was tidy, the window latched, and the door's key was still in the lock on the inside. A faint smell of bitter almonds lingered in the air, almost imperceptible. "Good heavens," Mr. Trent murmured, peering over Miss Marple's shoulder. "Is he?" "Quite dead, I'm afraid," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes scanning the room. She noted the untouched glass of water on the bedside table, the neatly made bed, and the absence of any signs of struggle. "We must fetch the constable at once." Victor Crane pushed past, his gaze cold. "Locked room! No marks, no weapon. This is no accident." His voice was clipped, almost accusing, as he looked at the others. Lillian clutched her robe, her voice trembling. "But how? The door was locked from the inside, and the window. Look, it's bolted tight." Mrs. Trent let out a small sob, clinging to her husband. "This place is cursed," she whispered. "We never should have come." "Nonsense," Miss Marple said briskly, though her tone was kind. "There's no curse here, only facts we haven't yet understood. Elsie, please telephone the village constable, and no one is to touch anything in this room." Elsie nodded, her face ashen, and hurried downstairs. Miss Marple took a moment to examine the scene more closely. The Colonel's brandy glass from the previous night was missing, she noted, though she recalled seeing it in his hand during their after-dinner conversation. The faint almond-like odour suggested something sinister, but she kept her thoughts to herself for now. The constable, a stout man named P.C. Hargreaves, arrived within the hour, puffing from his trudge through the snow. He surveyed the room with a furrowed brow, his notebook open. "Locked from the inside, you say? No signs of a break-in? This is a queer business, Miss Marple." "Indeed it is," she replied, her eyes bright. "But I've found that even the queerest puzzles have simple solutions once you see the threads clearly." Hargreaves scratched his head, clearly out of his depth. "I'll need to call in the doctor from Chipping Norton, and perhaps someone from Scotland Yard. This is beyond Winterby's usual troubles." As the guests retreated to the drawing-room, their faces a mix of shock and suspicion, Miss Marple lingered by the Colonel's door. She thought of the stories she'd heard in St. Mary Mead, of locked-room mysteries that were not mysteries at all, once you understood human nature. The Colonel's death was no accident, she was certain, and the bitter almond scent pointed to poison, perhaps cyanide. But how had it been administered, and by whom? She glanced at the other guests now huddled in the drawing-room, their voices low and tense. Lillian was pacing, her cigarette trembling in her hand. Crane stood by the window, his back to the room, his posture rigid. The Trents whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward the door. And Elsie, bringing in a tray of tea, seemed on the verge of tears. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire. Her knitting resumed, but her mind was far from idle. Someone in Snowdrop Cottage had a secret worth killing for, and she intended to unravel it, thread by careful thread. Chapter 5. Echoes of 1905. The morning after Colonel Bryce's death, Snowdrop Cottage felt colder, despite the fire roaring in the drawing-room. The snow outside had thickened, blanketing Winterby in a silence that seemed to amplify the tension within. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting idle in her lap, her eyes tracing the footprints that crisscrossed the garden, some fresh, others half-buried by the night's snowfall. The constable had cordoned off the Colonel's room, and the doctor from Chipping Norton was expected soon, but the guests were restless, their nerves frayed by the locked-room mystery. Miss Marple decided a walk to the village might clear her mind. She donned her coat and scarf, slipping out while the others lingered over a sombre breakfast. The path to Winterby was narrow, the snow crunching under her sensible boots. As she reached the village green, she spotted the post office, its windows steamed from within. A bell jingled as she entered, and an elderly woman with a sharp, bird-like face looked up from behind the counter. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "I'm staying at Snowdrop Cottage. A dreadful business up there, I'm afraid." The woman, whose nameplate read Mrs. Agnes Phipps, leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "So I heard. Colonel Bryce dead in a locked room. Winterby's not seen such a thing since, well, since the trouble at that very cottage nigh on 20 years ago." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained mild. "Trouble? My goodness, I hadn't heard. What happened, if you don't mind my asking?" Mrs. Phipps needed little encouragement. It was 1905 or thereabouts. Snowdrop Cottage was owned by a Mr. Alistair Gray, a wealthy sort who rented it out for holidays, much like now. One Christmas, a guest, a young man, name of Thomas Carver, vanished. Poof, gone without a trace. Some said he ran off with a local girl, others that he'd crossed a business partner and met a bad end. The cottage was shut up for years after. Folks said it was bad luck. "How fascinating," Miss Marple said, her eyes bright. "And no one ever found this Mr. Carver?" "Not a whisper," Mrs. Phipps said, lowering her voice. "But there were rumours, oh, such rumours. They said Gray had debts, and Carver was mixed up in some shady deal. The police poked about, but nothing came of it. The cottage changed hands after Gray died, and Mrs. Hartley's been renting it out these past few years." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the names and dates. "Thank you, Mrs. Phipps. You've been most helpful. I suppose the village hasn't forgotten that story." "Not likely," Mrs. Phipps said with a sniff. "Folks here have long memories. Mind yourself at that cottage, miss. There's something queer about it." As Miss Marple stepped back into the snow, her mind turned over the tale. A missing man, a scandal, a cottage with a shadowed past. It was all very suggestive. She thought of the guests, Lillian's brittle charm, Crane's guarded manner, the Trents' nervous glances. Could one of them be connected to this old mystery? And what of Mrs. Hartley, still absent? Back at the cottage, the atmosphere was strained. Lillian sat at the piano, picking out a melancholy tune, while Victor Crane stood by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames. The Trents were absent, likely in their room, and Elsie moved silently, clearing the breakfast dishes. "Any news from the constable?" Miss Marple asked, unwinding her scarf. Crane turned, his expression cold. "The doctor's arrived. Says it's likely poison, cyanide, from the smell. No marks on the body, no sign of how it was done. The police are stumped." Lillian stopped playing, her hands hovering over the keys. "Poison? In a locked room? It's like something out of a dreadful play." Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of calculation in her eyes, as if she were weighing her words. "It's quite puzzling," Miss Marple said, settling into her chair. "But puzzles have a way of solving themselves, given time. I wonder, did any of you know Colonel Bryce before this holiday?" The question hung in the air. Lillian shook her head quickly. "Never met him. He was just a loud old soldier, wasn't he?" Crane's lips twitched. "He talked too much, if you ask me. Always boasting about his past, India, investments, that sort of thing." Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet clicking. "Investments," she murmured. "How interesting. I recall he mentioned a business venture once, in India. Did he speak of it to you, Mr. Crane?" Crane's eyes narrowed, but he shrugged. "Vaguely. Something about a trading company that went bust. Old history." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind returning to Mrs. Phipps's story. A trading company, a missing man, a cottage with a past. There were threads here, and she was beginning to see their pattern. As Elsie passed with a tray, Miss Marple caught the girl's eye and offered a kind smile. Elsie flinched, nearly dropping the tray, and hurried out. The afternoon stretched on, the snow falling heavier now, isolating Snowdrop Cottage further. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a pretext for observation. The guests were like characters in one of her nephew's novels, each hiding something, each a piece of the puzzle. And somewhere, she was certain, lay a connection to Thomas Carver and the scandal of 1905. Chapter 6. Secrets by Firelight. The afternoon light faded early in Winterby, the snow-laden clouds casting Snowdrop Cottage into a premature twilight. Inside, the drawing-room was a cocoon of warmth, but the air was thick with suspicion. Miss Marple sat near the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm, her eyes moving from one guest to another. The doctor had confirmed Colonel Bryce's death as cyanide poisoning, but the locked room and absence of any obvious method left the constable baffled. The guests, confined by the snow and the investigation, grew restless, their masks of civility beginning to slip. Miss Marple had spent the morning reflecting on Mrs. Phipps's tale of Thomas Carver's disappearance and the scandal tied to Snowdrop Cottage. The mention of a failed trading company in Colonel Bryce's past, coupled with Victor Crane's cryptic remark about investments, suggested a thread worth tugging. She decided to probe gently, as was her way, letting the guests reveal themselves through their own words. At tea, served by a still nervous Elsie, Miss Marple turned to Lillian Vale, who was flicking through a magazine with exaggerated boredom. "Miss Vale," she said, her tone light, "you mentioned performing in the Merry Widow. Did you ever travel abroad for your roles? India, perhaps?" Lillian's fingers paused on the page, her smile tight. "India? Heavens, no! Too hot, too dusty. I prefer London stages, or Paris at a pinch." She laughed, but it was a brittle sound, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes flicked toward Victor Crane. Crane, standing by the window, turned at the mention of India. "Not much to recommend it these days," he said, his voice smooth but edged. "Too many failed ventures. Men like Bryce learned that the hard way." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Oh, did the Colonel speak of his ventures to you, Mr. Crane? He seemed quite proud of his past." Crane's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "He mentioned a trading company. Eastern Star, I think. Went under years ago. Too many greedy hands in the pot, he said." He sipped his tea, his eyes never leaving Miss Marple. "Eastern Star," Miss Marple repeated, as if merely curious. "How interesting. I wonder if Mrs. Hartley knew of it, given her connection to this cottage." The Trents, seated together on the sofa, exchanged a glance. Mr. Trent cleared his throat. "We wouldn't know about that," he said quickly. "We're just here for a holiday. Never met Bryce before, or Mrs. Hartley, except through letters." Mrs. Trent nodded, her hands twisting her handkerchief. "She wrote to us about a mutual friend," she said, her voice barely audible. "Someone we all knew long ago." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. "A mutual friend," she said gently. "How kind of Mrs. Hartley to bring you together. Was this friend connected to the Colonel, perhaps?" Mrs. Trent's face paled, and her husband cut in. "It's not important," he said, his tone sharp. "Just an old acquaintance. Nothing to do with what's happened." The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Lillian snapped her magazine shut. "This is all so dreary," she said, rising. "I'm going to my room. I can't stand all this talk of death and old business deals." She swept out, her heels clicking sharply. Miss Marple watched her go, then turned to Elsie, who was clearing the tea tray. "Elsie, dear," she said kindly, "have you worked for Mrs. Hartley long?" Elsie started, nearly dropping a cup. "Only this season, miss," she said, her eyes darting to the door. "She hired me through an agency in London. I don't know her well." "Thank you, Elsie," Miss Marple said, her smile reassuring. But she noted the girl's trembling hands and the way she avoided meeting anyone's gaze. There was fear there, and perhaps something more. As evening approached, Miss Marple took a turn about the cottage, her steps slow but purposeful. In the hallway, she paused by a small bookshelf, its volumes dusty and neglected. Among them was a faded ledger, its cover marked with the initials A.G. Alistair Gray, perhaps, the cottage's former owner. She opened it discreetly, finding columns of figures and names, including Eastern Star Trading Co., and a mention of a tea carver. The ledger was incomplete, its final pages torn out, but it was enough to confirm her suspicions. The past was not as buried as some might hope. Returning to the drawing room, she found Victor Crane alone, studying a map of the estate pinned to the wall. "Planning a walk, Mr. Crane?" she asked, her tone mild. He turned, his expression guarded. "Just curious about the grounds. This place has history, doesn't it? Old houses always do." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "And histories have a way of catching up with people, don't they?" Crane's smile was thin. "Sometimes, Miss Marple, but not always." He excused himself, leaving her alone with her thoughts. As the snow continued to fall, sealing Snowdrop Cottage from the outside world, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery tightening. The Eastern Star Trading Company, Thomas Carver's disappearance, Colonel Bryce's death. They were linked, she was certain. And the guests, each with their guarded secrets, were pieces in a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. Chapter 7. The Diary That Disappeared. The snow had ceased falling by the evening of Christmas Day, leaving Snowdrop Cottage wrapped in a crystalline stillness. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but serene. The guests, confined by the weather and the shadow of Colonel Bryce's death, moved about the house like actors in a play. Their lines cautious, their glances sharp. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting a steady rhythm, her mind piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. The Eastern Star Trading Company, Thomas Carver's disappearance, and the cyanide that had ended the Colonel's life in a locked room. Dinner was a subdued affair, with Elsie serving a simple meal of cold meats and potatoes. The Trents ate little, their eyes darting to the empty chair where Colonel Bryce had sat the previous night. Lillian Vale, her usual vivacity dimmed, picked at her food, while Victor Crane maintained his cool detachment, though Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed lightly on the table, a rare sign of unease. As coffee was served, Lillian rose abruptly, her face pale. "My diary," she said, her voice tight. "It's gone. I left it in my room this morning, and now it's not there." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Your diary, Miss Vale. How distressing. Was it of particular importance?" Lillian's eyes flicked to the others, her lips, O's trembling. It had my thoughts, my plans, private things. Someone's been in my room." Her voice rose, drawing a sharp look from Crane. "Calm yourself, Miss Vale," he said, his tone clipped. "It's probably misplaced. You were rather distracted this morning, weren't you?" Lillian flushed, her hands clenching. "I know where I left it, on my dressing table. It didn't walk off on its own." Mr. Trent cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. "Perhaps Elsie moved it while cleaning. These old houses, things get shifted about." Elsie, who had just entered with a fresh pot of coffee, froze. "I didn't touch nothing, sir," she said, her voice trembling. "I only dusted the surfaces, like Mrs. Hartley told me." Miss Marple smiled reassuringly at the girl. "Of course, Elsie, no one's accusing you. But perhaps you noticed something out of place in Miss Vale's room today." Elsie shook her head, her eyes wide. "No, miss. Everything looked normal. I didn't see no diary." Mrs. Trent, who had been silent, spoke up, her voice barely audible. "It's not right, going through someone's things. This place, it's not safe." Her husband squeezed her hand, his face taut. Miss Marple's mind turned over the new development. A missing diary suggested someone was searching for information or hiding it. She thought of the ledger she'd found, with its mention of the Eastern Star Trading Company and Thomas Carver. Could Lillian's diary contain a clue tying the guests to that old scandal? Or was it something more personal, more immediate? After dinner, as the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the hallway, her eyes catching a faint scuff mark on the floor near Lillian's room. It was slight, but it suggested a hurried movement, perhaps someone slipping in or out unnoticed. She made a mental note to watch the guests more closely. Later, in the drawing room, she overheard a hushed exchange between Mr. and Mrs. Trent, who stood by the window, their backs to the room. "We should leave," Mrs. Trent whispered, her voice urgent. "First the Colonel, now this diary business. It's too much, Harold." "We can't," Mr. Trent replied, his tone low but firm. "Not yet, not until we know what she knows." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression unchanged. She thought. Mrs. Hartley, perhaps? Or someone else entirely? The Trent's fear was palpable, and it hinted at a deeper connection to the events unfolding. As the evening wore on, Victor Crane excused himself, claiming a headache, though Miss Marple noted the way his eyes lingered on Lillian before he left. Lillian, meanwhile, paced the room, her earlier bravado replaced by a nervous energy. "I don't care what anyone says," she muttered. "Someone took it, and I want to know why." "Perhaps it will turn up," Miss Marple said gently. "Things have a way of reappearing when you least expect them. In the meantime, Miss Vale, might I ask what sort of things you wrote in your diary? Nothing too personal, I hope." Lillian hesitated, her fingers twisting her pearls. "Just notes about my career, engagements, people I've met, nothing anyone would care about." Her voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Of course," she said, her tone soothing. "But it's curious, isn't it? A diary disappearing just as we're all thrown together like this. Almost as if someone fears what it might reveal." Lillian's gaze sharpened, but she said nothing, turning instead to the piano and striking a few discordant notes. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind racing. The diary, the ledger, the Colonel's death, they were threads in a tapestry, and she was beginning to see the pattern. Someone in Snowdrop Cottage was desperate to keep a secret, and that desperation had already turned deadly. As the clock struck 10, the fire burned low, and the guests retired, their footsteps heavy with unease. Miss Marple remained, her eyes on the flickering flames. The missing diary was a clue, but it was also a warning. Whatever secrets it held, someone was willing to go to great lengths to keep them buried. Chapter 8. Footprints in the moonlit snow. The night was bitter, the snow outside Snowdrop Cottage piling high against the windows, sealing the house in a cocoon of white. Inside, the air was heavy with suspicion, the guests' nerves frayed by Colonel Bryce's death, and the mystery of Lillian Vale's missing diary. Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room fire, her knitting a pretext for observation, her mind weaving together the threads of the Eastern Star Trading Company, Thomas Carver's disappearance, and the cyanide that had claimed the Colonel in a locked room. As midnight approached, a faint noise from the garden caught her ear. A soft crunch, like footsteps in the snow. She rose quietly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and moved to the window. The garden was bathed in moonlight, the snow untouched save for a single trail of footprints leading from the house to a small shed near the hedge. The prints were fresh, too large for Elsie's small feet, and too deliberate for a casual stroll. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before slipping on her coat and boots. She stepped out through the kitchen door, careful to avoid creaking floorboards. The cold bit at her cheeks, but her senses were sharp as she followed the footprints, her eyes scanning the shadows. The shed door was ajar, and a faint light flickered within, as if from a candle or match. She paused, listening. A low voice, male, she thought, muttered something indistinct, followed by the sound of something being moved, perhaps a crate or box. Miss Marple crept closer, her heart steady despite the chill. Peering through the crack in the door, she glimpsed a figure in a dark coat, their back to her, rummaging through a pile of old gardening, tools and crates. The figure turned slightly, and the moonlight caught the edge of a familiar profile. Victor Crane. Before she could retreat, the figure stiffened, as if sensing her presence. Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows, her breath shallow. The light in the shed went out, and Crane emerged, his face pale in the moonlight, his hands empty but his expression tense. He scanned the garden, his eyes narrowing, then hurried back toward the house, his footsteps obliterating the trail he'd left. Miss Marple waited until he was gone before approaching the shed. Inside, the air was musty, heavy with the scent of damp wood and earth. She struck a match from her pocket, its flame revealing a jumble of rusted tools, a broken wheelbarrow, and a small crate pushed hastily into a corner. Kneeling, she examined the crate, noting fresh scratches on its lid, as if it had been recently opened. Inside were old papers, yellowed and brittle, but on top lay a single sheet, torn from a notebook, with the words Eastern Star scrawled in faded ink. She slipped the paper into her pocket, her mind racing. The shed was an unlikely place for such a find, unless someone had hidden it there, or been searching for it. Crane's late-night visit suggested he knew more than he'd let on, but was he hiding evidence or seeking it? Back in the house, Miss Marple found the drawing-room empty, the fire reduced to embers. She sat, her knitting resumed, as she considered the footprints. They were too large for Elsie, too narrow for Colonel Bryce, and didn't match the heavy boots Mr. Trent wore. Lillian's heels would have left a different mark, and Mrs. Trent hadn't left her room all evening. That left Crane, or perhaps someone else, someone not yet accounted for. The next morning, the guests gathered for breakfast, their faces drawn. The constable had returned, announcing that Scotland Yard would send an inspector once the snow cleared, likely tomorrow. Lillian, her eyes red-rimmed, complained again about her diary. "It's not just a diary," she snapped, her voice breaking. "It had names, dates, things I needed." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression mild. "Names, Miss Vale? Perhaps someone you met through your work, or through Mrs. Hartley." Lillian flushed, her hands trembling. "Just people. It's not important." But her eyes darted to Crane, who was buttering his toast with deliberate care. Mr. Trent spoke up, his voice strained. This is getting out of hand. First the Colonel. Now Diary's going missing. What's next?" Mrs. Trent clutched his arm, her voice a whisper. "We should never have come. I told you, Harold, it's that name, Carver. It's cursed." The room stilled. Miss Marple's needles paused. "Carver?" she said gently. "An unusual name. Did you know someone by that name, Mrs. Trent?" Mrs. Trent's face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands. Her husband glared at Miss Marple, his voice sharp. "It's nothing. An old story. Leave it alone." Crane set down his knife with a clink. "Old stories have a way of resurfacing, don't they?" he said, his eyes cold. "Like footprints in the snow." Miss Marple met his gaze, her own serene but piercing. "Indeed, Mr. Crane, and footprints can tell us so much, if we know how to read them." The meal ended in silence, the guests dispersing quickly. Miss Marple lingered, her mind on the paper in her pocket and the footprints in the snow. Crane's nocturnal search, Lillian's diary, the Trent's fear of the name Carver. It was all connected, she was certain, to the Eastern Star Trading Company and the events of 1905. But the how and why remained just out of reach, like a shadow moving in the snow. Chapter 9. A Second Poisoning. The morning of Boxing Day brought a brief respite from the snow, the clouds parting to reveal a pale, cold sun over Winterby. Snowdrop Cottage, however, remained cloaked in gloom, its guests haunted by Colonel Bryce's death and the lingering questions of Lillian's missing diary, and the secrets tied to the Eastern Star Trading Company. Miss Marple sat in the dining room, sipping tea, her knitting idle as she watched the others. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, each guest eyeing the others with suspicion. Victor Crane was absent from breakfast, claiming a need to stretch his legs in the garden, though Miss Marple had noted his absence coincided with Elsie's hurried cleaning of the upstairs rooms. Lillian Vale, her makeup heavier than usual to mask her sleepless eyes, picked at a piece of toast. The Trents sat close together, their faces drawn, their conversation limited to murmurs. Elsie moved silently, her hands trembling as she poured tea, her gaze fixed on the floor. As Miss Marple considered the paper she'd found in the shed, bearing the words Eastern Star, a sudden cry from upstairs shattered the quiet. It was Mrs. Trent, her voice high and panicked. "Harold! Harold, no!" Miss Marple rose swiftly, following Lillian and Elsie up the stairs. In the Trents' room, Mr. Harold Trent lay slumped on the floor, his face flushed and his breathing shallow. Mrs. Trent knelt beside him, sobbing, clutching his hand. "He just collapsed," she gasped. "We were talking, and then, oh please, someone help." Lillian hovered in the doorway, her hand over her mouth. Is it like the Colonel?" she whispered. Miss Marple knelt beside Mr. Trent, her fingers gently checking his pulse. It was rapid but weak, and his lips had a faint bluish tinge. A glass of water lay spilled on the floor, its contents soaking into the rug. That faint, bitter almond scent lingered again, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to Miss Marple's keen senses. "Elsie," she said calmly, "fetch the doctor at once, and the constable. Tell them it's urgent." Elsie nodded, her face ashen, and fled down the stairs. Victor Crane appeared in the doorway, his coat dusted with snow. "What's this?" he asked, his voice sharp. His eyes flicked to Mr. Trent, then to the spilled glass, and Miss Marple noted the brief tightening of his jaw. "Mr. Trent is ill," she said, her tone measured. "Possibly poisoned, like Colonel Bryce. We must keep this room untouched until the doctor arrives." "Poisoned?" Lillian's voice rose, her hands trembling. "Again! This is madness! Someone in this house is a murderer!" Mrs. Trent let out a wail, clinging to her husband. "Why us? Why him? We only came because of her letter." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Her letter, Mrs. Trent? Mrs. Hartley's, you mean?" Mrs. Trent nodded, tears streaming down her face. She said she knew about Thomas, about what happened. She said we had to come, or it would all come out." "Thomas?" Crane's voice was low, almost a growl. "Thomas Carver, you mean?" Mrs. Trent froze, her eyes wide with fear. "How do you know that name?" she whispered. Crane's expression remained impassive, but his fingers curled slightly. "Old stories travel, Mrs. Trent, especially ones about missing men and failed companies." Miss Marple filed away the exchange, her mind racing. The mention of Thomas Carver, the spilled glass, the cyanide-like smell, it was all too deliberate. Someone was targeting the guests and the pattern was becoming clearer. She thought of the footprints in the snow, Crane's nocturnal search in the shed, and Lillian's missing diary. The threads were tightening, but the motive remained elusive. The doctor arrived within the hour, a brisk man named Dr. Simmons, who confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. "Cyanide, most likely," he said, examining Mr. Trent, who was now semi-conscious and moved to the bed. "He's had a smaller dose than the Colonel, I'd wager. He might pull through with treatment, but we need to get him to hospital." The constable, P.C. Hargreaves, looked overwhelmed. "2 poisonings in 2 days. This is beyond me, Miss Marple. Scotland Yard's coming tomorrow, but I don't know how we'll keep things calm till then." "Calmness comes with clarity," Miss Marple said gently, "and clarity comes from observation. Might I suggest checking the water jug in this room, and perhaps the kitchen, where the glasses are kept?" Hargreaves nodded, scribbling in his notebook. As he and the doctor arranged for Mr. Trent's transport, Miss Marple turned her attention to the guests. Lillian was pacing, muttering about leaving as soon as the roads cleared. Crane stood by the window, his back to the room, his silence louder than words. Mrs. Trent sat by her husband, her face a mask of fear and guilt. Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room. Her knitting resumed, but her mind was far from idle. 2 poisonings, both with cyanide, suggested a calculated hand. The locked room, the missing diary, the shed's secrets, all pointed to a past that refused to stay buried. And Mrs. Hartley's absence loomed larger than ever, her letter the spark that had ignited this deadly gathering. As the ambulance carted Mr. Trent away, the cottage seemed to close in, its walls heavy with secrets. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes bright. The killer was among them, and she was determined to unravel their motive before another tragedy struck. Chapter 10. Lies Frozen Beneath the Ice. The afternoon of Boxing Day cast a pale, grey light over Snowdrop Cottage. The snow outside now packed hard from the comings and goings of the constable and doctor. Inside, the air was taut with fear and suspicion, the guests reeling from Mr. Trent's poisoning and the shadow of Colonel Bryce's death. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting a steady rhythm, her mind weaving together the clues, the cyanide, Lillian's missing diary, Victor Crane's nocturnal search, and the spectre of Thomas Carver's disappearance tied to the Eastern Star Trading Company. With Mr. Trent now at the hospital in Chipping Norton, clinging to life, and Mrs. Trent at his side, the remaining guests, Lillian Vale, Victor Crane, and Miss Marple, gathered uneasily for tea. Elsie served with her usual nervous haste, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. The constable had left to meet the Scotland Yard inspector, expected by evening, leaving the cottage in a tense limbo. Miss Marple decided it was time to tug at a loose thread. She turned to Lillian, who was stirring her tea with a distracted air. "Miss Vale," she said gently, "you mentioned your diary contained names and dates. I wonder if any of those names might have caused someone concern. Someone here, perhaps?" Lillian's spoon clattered against her cup, her face flushing. "I told you, it was just personal notes. Nothing to do with any of this." Her voice was sharp, but her eyes darted to Crane, who sat across the room, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Of course," she said, her tone mild. "But it's curious, isn't it? A diary goes missing, and then poor Mr. Trent falls ill just like the Colonel. It makes one wonder if someone fears what might be written down." Crane set his cup down with a deliberate clink, his eyes narrowing. "You're fishing, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and cold. "If you've something to say, out with it." Miss Marple met his gaze, her own serene but piercing. "Very well, Mr. Crane. I couldn't help but notice you were out in the garden last night, near the shed. I found a paper there, with Eastern Star written on it. The same company Colonel Bryce mentioned, and one tied to an old scandal here at Snowdrop Cottage. Would you know anything about that?" The room stilled, Elsie freezing mid-step with the teapot. Lillian's breath caught, her hands gripping her chair. Crane leaned forward, his jaw tight, his voice dangerously soft. "You're a sharp one, aren't you?" "Yes, I was in the shed. Looking for something, old records, if you must know. Bryce was always blathering about his glory days, and I thought there might be papers in the cottage to back it up. Or disprove it." "Disprove it?" Miss Marple asked, her tone deceptively innocent. "Were you and Colonel Bryce connected through the Eastern Star Trading Company, perhaps?" Crane's smile was thin, almost a grimace. "Hardly. I was a boy when that company collapsed. But Bryce, he had enemies from those days, people who lost everything. I wondered if his death was tied to that." Lillian laughed, a harsh, nervous sound. "Enemies? You're one to talk, Mr. Crane. I saw you arguing with him the night he died, out in the hall. You looked ready to throttle him." Crane's eyes flashed, but his voice remained steady. "We had words, yes. He was drunk, boasting about his investments, hinting he knew things about me. I told him to keep his mouth shut, that's all." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright. "And yet, Mr. Crane, you didn't mention this to the constable. Nor did you mention your interest in the shed. One might think you had something to hide." Crane rose, his hands clenched at his sides. "I don't care for your insinuations, Miss Marple. I'm no murderer. If you want to point fingers, ask Miss Vale why her diary's so important, or why the Trents were whispering about Thomas Carver." Lillian stood, her face pale. "Leave me out of this. I've done nothing wrong." She turned to storm out, but Miss Marple's voice stopped her. "Miss Vale," she said gently, "if your diary contains nothing of importance, why are you so distressed? Perhaps you wrote something about Colonel Bryce, or Mr. Trent, or even Mrs. Hartley." Lillian froze, her back to the room. I didn't," she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. She fled upstairs, her footsteps echoing. Elsie, still clutching the teapot, looked near tears. "Please, miss," she whispered to Miss Marple, "I don't know nothing about diaries or poison. I just do my work." "Of course, Elsie," Miss Marple said kindly, but her eyes lingered on the girl's trembling hands. She thought of the kitchen, where the water jugs were filled, and the faint almond scent in both victims' rooms. Elsie's fear was genuine, but was it fear of discovery or something else? As Crane left the room, His parting glance at Miss Marple was one of grudging respect mixed with wariness. She resumed her knitting, her mind racing. Crane's admission about the shed and his argument with Bryce was a step forward, but it raised new questions. Why was he so interested in the Eastern Star records? And what had Lillian written in her diary that made her so defensive? The name Thomas Carver loomed larger, a ghost tying the guests to a past they all seemed to fear. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Hartley's letter, luring them here, and the cyanide that had struck twice. The killer was growing bold, and with Scotland Yard's arrival imminent, she knew time was running short to unravel the truth. Chapter 11. Confessions on Christmas Night. The evening of Boxing Day cloaked Snowdrop Cottage in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling under the weight of the snow. The guests, shaken by Mr. Trent's poisoning and the shadow of Colonel Bryce's death, gathered in the drawing-room, their faces etched with strain. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the tension, her mind weaving together the clues, the cyanide, Lillian's missing diary, Victor Crane's shed search, and the persistent spectre of Thomas Carver and the Eastern Star Trading Company. The Scotland Yard inspector was delayed by a fresh snowdrift, leaving the guests under P.C. Hargreaves's uneasy watch. Miss Marple, sensing the killer's growing desperation, decided it was time to stir the pot. She had observed the guests' reactions to her earlier questions, particularly Crane's guarded admission and Lillian's defensiveness. A reenactment of Christmas Eve, she thought, might jolt someone into revealing more than they intended. P.C. Hargreaves, she said, her voice gentle but firm, might I suggest we revisit the events of Christmas Eve? It could help us understand how Colonel Bryce met his end. Perhaps the guests could retrace their movements that evening, just as they were. Hargreaves, looking relieved for any guidance, nodded. Right, miss. Anything to make sense of this mess. Let's gather everyone and walk through it. The guests, minus the Trents, assembled in the dining room where the Christmas Eve dinner had taken place. Lillian Vale, her eyes wary, stood by the table, while Victor Crane leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. Elsie hovered in the background, clutching a tray, her face pale. Miss Marple took her seat, her expression serene, but her eyes sharp. "Let's begin with dinner," Miss Marple said. "We all sat here, didn't we? Colonel Bryce was at the head, telling his stories. Mr. Crane, you were to his right, I believe?" Crane nodded, his jaw tight. "That's right. He was in fine form, boasting about India and his investments." Lillian, seated across from Miss Marple, fidgeted with her napkin. "He was loud as usual, kept going on about his glory days. I barely listened." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, though her knitting lay untouched. "And after dinner, we moved to the drawing-room for coffee. Elsie, you served us, didn't you?" Elsie nodded, her voice barely audible. "Yes, miss. I brought the coffee and cleared the dishes. Then I went to the kitchen." "Quite right," Miss Marple said. "And Mr. Crane, you and the Colonel had words in the hallway later, didn't you? Miss Vale mentioned seeing you." Crane's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Yes, we argued. He was drunk, hinting at things he shouldn't. I told him to mind his own business." Lillian's head snapped up. "You were angry, Mr. Crane. I saw you grab his arm. It looked personal." Crane's voice was cold. "It was nothing of the sort. He was meddling, that's all. I went to my room after." Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone mild. "And yet, Colonel Bryce was poisoned that night, in a locked room. Let's retrace those final moments. Elsie, could you show us how you brought the Colonel his tea the next morning?" Elsie hesitated, then nodded, fetching a tray from the sideboard. She mimicked her actions, carrying it to an imaginary door. "I knocked, like I always do," she said, her voice trembling. "He didn't answer, so I used the spare key. That's when I found him." Miss Marple watched closely, noting the way Elsie's hands shook as she set down the tray. "And the tea, Elsie? Did you prepare it yourself?" "Yes, miss," Elsie said quickly. "From the kitchen, like always. I didn't do anything to it." "Of course not," Miss Marple said soothingly. But her mind was on the water glass in the Colonel's room and the spilled glass in Mr. Trent's. Both had carried that faint almond scent. "Let's move to the drawing-room, shall we? Perhaps something there will jog a memory." As they filed into the drawing-room, Miss Marple paused by the coffee tray from Christmas Eve, still on the sideboard. She lifted the silver pot, her fingers brushing the spout. "Curious," she said almost to herself. "The coffee pot was full when we finished, wasn't it? Yet I recall Colonel Bryce taking a second cup, poured from this very pot." Lillian's face paled. "What are you saying? That the coffee was poisoned?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "But it's interesting, don't you think? Who poured the Colonel's second cup?" The room fell silent. Crane's eyes flicked to Elsie, who shrank back. I don't remember," Elsie stammered. "I was clearing the cups. I didn't pour nothing." Lillian's voice was sharp. "I didn't touch the pot after dinner. I was at the piano playing." Crane shrugged, his tone cool. "Don't look at me. I was by the fire, talking to Bryce. If anyone poured it, it was one of the Trents." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was sharp. "Or perhaps," she said, "someone added something to the Colonel's cup later, in the hallway, during your argument, Mr. Crane, or even in his room before it was locked." Crane's face darkened, but before he could respond, Elsie let out a small gasp, her tray slipping from her hands. It crashed to the floor, the sound jarring in the quiet room. "I didn't do it," she cried, tears welling. "I swear I didn't, but I saw something that night. In the hallway, after dinner. Someone was near the Colonel's door, holding a glass." The room froze. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "Who, Elsie? Who did you see?" Elsie's eyes darted to Lillian, then away. It was Miss Vale," she whispered. "She was standing there, looking nervous. I thought she was just lost or something." Lillian's face drained of colour. "That's a lie!" she snapped, her voice shrill. "I was in my room. I never went near his door." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, her expression unchanged. "Thank you, Elsie," she said softly. "You've been very helpful." As Lillian stormed out, her protests echoing, Miss Marple's mind raced. Elsie's confession was a turning point, but was it the truth or a desperate deflection? Lillian's reaction suggested guilt or fear, and Crane's silence during the exchange was as telling as his earlier words. The killer was close, Miss Marple felt, and the reenactment had shaken loose a vital clue. Now, she needed only the final piece to unravel the deadly tapestry of Snowdrop Cottage. Chapter 12. The Ghost of Evelyn Hartley. The drawing-room of Snowdrop Cottage was stifling despite the chill seeping through the windows, as if the weight of secrets had thickened the air. The snow outside had paused, leaving the world in a hushed, expectant stillness. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting abandoned, her eyes bright as she prepared to unravel the mystery that had claimed Colonel Bryce's life and nearly taken Mr. Trent's. The Scotland Yard inspector, a sharp-eyed man named Inspector Grayson, had arrived at last, and with P.C. Hargreaves, Lillian Vale, Victor Crane and Elsie gathered, Miss Marple requested a final gathering to lay the truth bare. "Inspector," she began, her voice gentle but clear, "I believe we can now explain the tragic events at Snowdrop Cottage. It's a matter of seeing the threads clearly